I'm Robert Lomas, and this is the second episode of a serial written by Daniel Owen called 10 Nights in the Black Lion. This episode was first published on March the 26th, 1859. Episode 2, The First Night. I had not been long reading the newspapers in my room when I heard a great noise coming from the bar-room. I went down to see what was going on. The first person I saw was Willie Hammond. He was speaking to another man, who was much older than he was, but there was a big difference in their attitudes. While Hammond's demeanour showed generosity, gentleness, and cheerfulness, I could see only selfishness on the face of the man who was speaking to him. There was no trace of kindness about him. Two such different people could never meet as friends anywhere other than in a pub. I later discovered that this man's name was Harvey Green, and he was a regular visitor to Cedarville. I asked Simon Slade about Green, and he told me, "There's one thing about him that I find very attractive. He's got plenty of money and he's quite free spending it. For many years he used to visit once or twice a year, but he didn't stay long, because the pub where he lodged was cluttered and uncomfortable. Now he books one of my best rooms and pays a large sum to retain it over the year. He never spends less than £100 in our village every time he comes here. This just goes to show the value of a good pub." "What does he do?" I asked. "Does he have a stake in some business around here?" My question seemed to confuse the innkeeper. He lifted his shoulders and shook his head, and obviously didn't know how to answer. Then, after some thought, he said, "I don't usually ask anyone's trade. My business is to give everyone what they ask for if they pay for it. As a miller, I wouldn't ask my customer whether he grew, bought or stole his wheat. My job was to grind it. It's the same with my pub. It's my duty to mind my own business." There were 4 other men in the bar-room besides Hammond and Green. One of them was the so-called Judge Lyman. He was called Judge because he was an American senator. He was between 40 and 50 years of age, and had recently come over from the Republic of the United States. He seemed charming, and maintained an air of humility about life and society. I overheard him discussing the opening of the new pub. "What's strange to me," said Judge Lyman, "is that no one has seen the need to open a good pub in Cedarville before, or have the money to establish it. This is a priority our friend Slade has taken up on behalf of us all. He sees further than any of us. Just hear what I say now. 10 years from now, Slade will be the richest man in Cedarville. No, not just in Cedarville, but in the whole publican's trade." "Ho, what nonsense! Ho, ho, ho!" said Simon Slade, with a deep-bellied laugh. "The richest man? You forget Willie's father, Judge Hammond." "No, I don't forget Judge Hammond," said Lyman, smiling at the boy, "with all due respect to our good friend Willie." Then a new voice chipped in from the far side of the bar. "If Slade gets any richer, then he must make someone else poorer," the interloper said. I saw Slade's expression change as the man spoke up. He looked annoyed. The bar went quiet. No one answered the man, and the silence lasted some time. The man looked as if he was enjoying the impact of his words. Then Harvey Green broke the awkward hush. "If our respected friend Mr. Slade is not the richest man in Cedarville in 10 years' time," said Harvey Green, "he will at least be proud that he's made his town richer." "Truly you say," added Lyman. "Cedarville was such a dead, inhospitable place until recently. Local trade has suffered, but now we're on the pathway to success." "And to the graveyard as well," said the man who had previously spoken up. The men at the bar turned round to stare at him. "Come on, Simon," he said, getting up and crossing the floor towards Slade. "Give me a good shot of hot whisky punch. Here's my last 6pence to help you make your fortune." He turned his pockets inside out. "See, I've nothing else left, so I'm sending it to keep company with the other 4 sixpences you've already had from me today. The poor lonely thing is too sad without its friends." Slade poured a whisky and set it on the bar. The man took it back to the far side of the room to sit and drink it, but he kept throwing comments into the common talk, and what he said obviously disconcerted and offended the gentry. At last Slade lost patience with him. "Listen, Joe Morgan," he said, his voice sounding slightly regretful, "if you can't behave, you'd better go elsewhere, and stop insulting the gentry." "Ha! "Now you've had me last sixpence, you don't want to see me any more tonight, do you?" said Morgan, again turning out his empty pockets. "I suppose that's the way of the world. How suddenly our old friend Simon Whitejacket has become studious in his new school. Well, he was a good miller, can't deny that, and it's quite clear that he's studying to become a good innkeeper. I thought that his heart would be too tender to succeed in this trade, but he's making good progress. But Joe Morgan predicts that if he succeeds, his heart will become 7 times harder than any of his old grinding stones within 10 years. He stared at Slade. "Don't you frown at me, Simon. We're old pals, and it's only right for old pals to speak honestly." Slade obviously decided there was nothing to gain by having a public quarrel with Joe Morgan. "Wish you'd go home," he said, adopting a more gentle tone of voice. "You're not yourself tonight." Then his face broke into a warm smile. "My heart might get harder," he said, "but it may need to. I've heard you say many a time I was too soft-hearted." "There's no danger of that now," replied Morgan. At that moment the bar door slowly opened and a small, pale face appeared. A pair of tiny, penetrating blue eyes peered round the room. The noisy conversation stopped as everyone in the bar looked at the child who had just come in. She was a young girl, well under the age of 10, and her pale face and impoverished appearance was enough to pierce the hardest heart that saw her. "Father," said the young girl. I had never heard the word father said with such feeling. Her face was filled with distressed love, and her voice came through a stream of tears. Morgan stood up. "Come on, come home," he said. As I write this, I imagine I hear her voice once more. Poor little one. Such dark shadows rose in the morning skies of this tiny angel. Morgan went to the door and took his child away. There was a moment or so's pause as they left, but Harvey Green soon spoke up. "If I were in your place, Mr. Slade," he said in a cold and tense voice, "I'd kick that guy out if he tries to come in here again. He's no business being here in the first place. He doesn't know how to behave among honourable companions." "I really wish he would stay away," said Slade, sounding genuinely distressed. "I'd make him stay away," said Green. "That's easier said than done," chipped Judge Lyman. "Our friend keeps a public house, and he cannot say who can and cannot come in." "But a creature like that has no business here. His sort is no good. If I was a publican I wouldn't sell to him," said Green. "You could refuse to serve him," said Lyman, "and if our friend Mr. Slade did that, it would be no great loss to him." One of the other men in the bar spoke up. "Morgan will get what liquor he can while he has money to buy it," he said. "Joe's sometimes cynical, but no one can say he's quarrelsome. You take him as you see him, that's it." Meanwhile Harvey Green was getting rather excited. "I am one," he said, "that wouldn't associate with anyone unless they knew how to act in company. If I were in Mr. Slade's place, I'd kick that guy out the next time he tries to come through the door." "You wouldn't if I were standing between you and him," said the man who had spoken up for Morgan. Green jumped to his feet, eyes flashing with anger. He moved aggressively towards the man. "What are you saying, sir?" he said threateningly. The man wore the clothes of a working man, and he had a strong, tough, and solid constitution. "I think you heard my words well enough," said the man. "I spoke clearly." He didn't move from where he was sitting. "You're a stupid and intrusive creature, and I'm minded to hit you," said Green. Green had barely finished speaking when he found himself whimpering on the floor. The man sprang at him like a tiger, and with one blow laid him full length. He lay there for over a minute. Then he started shuddering and shouting out, using the most beastly oaths I've ever heard. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife, and tried to lunge and cut his challenger. The man instantly saw his murderous intent and kicked him back down, stamping on Green's arm until he loosened his grip on the weapon. The workman booted the knife to the far end of the room. The man, whose name I later found out was Mr. Lyon, was blazing with anger at Green. He took a pint glass in his hand, knelt on Green's chest and pushed the glass into his face. "Take a knife to me, would you?" he said. "I won't rip your head from your body right now, but I'll take a would-be killer and squeeze him a bit thinner." And as he said this he was pushing down hard on the glass, which looked likely to shatter. Judge Lyman and Slade rushed to hold him back, and Lyon let them pull him away. Then Lyman and Willie Hammond took Green out of the bar-room to one of the upper rooms. I stayed behind. I was left alone with Lyon and struck up a conversation with him. He told me more of the history of Joe Morgan. "Joe's poor," he said, "but he wasn't always so. He's an old friend of Simon Slade's. They were apprentices together in the same mill and worked together all their lives. Joe Morgan's father was the millwright, and Joe inherited the mill after his death. He spent a lot of money repairing it and fell into debt. Then Morgan took Slade on to work for him. Shortly afterwards, Slade inherited money from an uncle. Morgan was friendly with Slade and was so eager to clear his debt that he sold part of the mill to him. Morgan had never been very interested in the milling business, and he left the day-to-day running to Simon Slade. And to tell the truth, Slade was careful with the business. He was always working while Morgan hardly went near. Well, within 10 years, Slade owned the whole lot, and Joe was left with nothing. But there's something about Joe that makes everyone like him, despite his lack of business sense. He's always neighbourly and helpful." "How do you mean?" I asked. "Well, about 2 years before losing the mill, Joe married Fanny Ellis, the most beautiful girl in the county. Fanny could easily have taken a pick of the young men in the area, and many wondered why she took Morgan. But he was such a charming boy in so many ways, it was little wonder. He was always the man to win the heart of a romantic girl like Fanny." Mr. Lyon was so heated by his feelings that by now he was speaking quite loudly. "Well, days of tumult and poverty have caught up with her now. But she'll never say a bad word about her husband. She's shown him nothing but love. Takes the greatest care of him. And Joe loves her too, for all his drunkenness. He's never abused her, not even when he's drunk. If he had, I'm sure Fanny would be in her grave already by now. How I pity Fanny and poor Joe. It's such a waste that he keeps coming here to get drunk." Judge Lyman, Harvey Green and Willie Hammond had left the bar-room shortly after the fight, and Slade had gone with them. He hadn't come back to tend the bar, but left that to young Frank. While Lyon was explaining Joe Morgan's history to me, I saw something that greatly disturbed me. A man came into the bar and called for a toddy. He drank a little and went out, leaving a half-full glass behind. Frank took up the glass and drank it quickly, as if he was afraid someone might see him. By 10 o'clock there was only me left in the bar, and I reflected on what I had seen that night. What hit me most was the memory of Joe Morgan's daughter. I kept remembering the moment that her pale face appeared round the door, and I kept hearing her voice saying the word, "Father." I thought about Willie Hammond too. What I saw and heard about him caused my heart to consider the danger he was in. So many opportunities were available to him. He had riches, honour, and the chance of a high and respectable life laid out before him. But an enemy had set upon him, which if he did not flee from the drink would eventually deprive him of all these possibilities. While ruminating on these things, I heard the door of the bar-room open, and an older man came in. He had a respectful and polite demeanour, and his hair was white, but his face was lined with hard work and worry. He looked round the room, and seeing I was the only one there, asked, "Is Mr. Slade in?" I answered him politely, saying I didn't know. Just then Mrs. Slade came in through another door and stood behind the counter. "Mrs. Slade, good evening to you, ma'am," the man said. "Good evening, Judge Hammond," she replied. "Is Mr. Slade in?" "I think he's somewhere about," said Mrs. Slade. "Will you ask him to come here for a minute, please?" Mrs. Slade went out, and about 5 minutes later Slade came back. His face showed none of his usual cheerfulness and satisfaction. He looked rushed, and seemed to be struggling to look Judge Hammond in the eye. Hammond, speaking in a low and distressed voice, asked if his son had been there during the evening. Yes, he was here," said Slade. "When?" "He came shortly after dusk and stayed about an hour or so." "He wasn't here after that?" "It's been almost 2 hours since he left the bar," said the publican. Judge Hammond appeared confused. He could see that Slade was hiding something, so he asked again, "Was Judge Lyman here tonight?" "Yes, he was." "And did he and Willie leave together?" The question seemed to dumbfound Slade. He looked like he didn't know what to answer. "I don't know where they went." "Oh, so he might be at Judge Lyman's house. I will call there," said Judge Hammond, and he went out. Turning to me and trying to force a smile onto his face, the innkeeper said, "Do you want to go to your room to rest?" "Yes, please," I replied. He lit a candle and took me up to my room. I was distracted by my thoughts about the twilight troubles and soon fell asleep. I left the next day, and I didn't see any of the people who had been in the bar room the night before. This is the end of the second episode of 10 Nights in the Black Lion, written by Daniel Owen in 1859, and this episode was first published on March the 26th, 1859. I'm Robert Lomas, and I've recently translated this work, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then please click the subscribe box in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen.